The sun had already set behind the low hills when the last of the shop lights in town began to flicker off. It was a small place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. People waved when they passed each other on the street, and Sunday mornings were spent together at the church or the park. It wasn't perfect, but there was peace. Children rode their bikes freely, and neighbors shared whatever little they had. But lately, that peace had been fading. It started with whispers. Rumors that a group of troublemakers from the next county had been seen hanging around the outskirts. They came in loud trucks, engines growling, music blaring, shouting things that made people's stomachs twist. At first, they didn't stay long, just enough to make their presence known, to laugh and scare a few people before speeding off again. But over time, it became clear they were testing something, testing how far they could go. One morning, the bakery's windows were found smashed. Another night, someone spray-painted ugly words on the side of the church. The old pastor tried to calm everyone down, saying maybe it was just kids being foolish. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't just kids. There was a bitterness behind those acts, a hate that didn't belong to this town. The police station sat right in the center of Main Street, but it was small. Just 2 officers and an aging chief who was more comfortable with lost dogs and noise complaints than serious trouble. When people reported the incidents, the police promised to keep an eye out, but nothing really changed. They'd drive around once or twice a night, then go home. The fear grew quietly, like a shadow that kept spreading no matter how many lights were turned on. Families began closing their shops earlier. The diner that used to stay open till midnight started shutting down before sunset. Parents told their kids not to go out after dark. It was strange to see the streets so empty in the evenings. The laughter that used to echo down the main road was gone, replaced by silence and worry. Then one afternoon, a pickup truck pulled up outside the hardware store. 4 men stepped out, clean-cut, strong-looking, but dressed simply in jeans and jackets. Nobody knew them, but they didn't act like outsiders. They greeted people politely, helped carry boxes for the shop owner, and chatted with the locals. One of them mentioned they'd come to visit a friend in town. People were polite, but they didn't ask too many questions. The town had learned not to pry into strangers' business lately. The next few days, the same men were seen around, helping rebuild the bakery window, repairing a fence near the park, even joining the pastor for coffee in the morning. They never said much about themselves, but they had a calm confidence that stood out. Something about the way they looked around, alert, watchful, gave the sense they were paying attention to everything. Meanwhile, the tension was getting worse. One night, loud engines echoed from the highway. Someone counted at least 6 trucks. They didn't stop in town, but they slowed down near the sign that said, "Welcome to our community." The next morning, that sign was found burned halfway through. That was the moment people began locking their doors for real. Inside the diner, the air was thick with unease. A few locals gathered for breakfast, talking quietly about what to do. Some wanted to leave town for a while. Others said leaving would only make things worse. The 4 new men sat in a corner booth listening but saying nothing. When the waitress came by, one of them asked softly, "When did this all start?" She hesitated, then told him everything she knew about the trucks, the vandalism, the fear. He nodded slowly. "You folks shouldn't have to live like this," he said. That night, the town felt colder. A storm was brewing far off and thunder rolled across the fields. The few streetlights that worked flickered weakly. In one of the small houses near the edge of town, a mother tucked her little boy into bed. He asked if the bad men were coming again. She told him no, but her voice shook a little as she said it. Down the street, the 4 men stood outside the diner looking out toward the dark highway. They spoke quietly among themselves, their tone serious. One of them pointed toward the tree line. "That's where they'll come from if they try something," he said. Another nodded. "We'll be ready." They didn't tell anyone what they were planning. They didn't want to scare people more than they already were. But the next day, a few locals noticed small changes. The streetlights that had been out for weeks suddenly worked again. Someone repaired the old security camera outside the grocery store, and just before evening, the town's main road seemed a little clearer. Branches and old junk that used to block the sides were suddenly gone. Nobody knew who did it, but they had a feeling. As the week went on, life tried to continue as normal.
Kids still went to school, though their parents watched the clock until they came home.
The grocery store opened each morning with a smile, even if the owner kept glancing at the door every few minutes. The fear was still there, but so was pride. No one wanted to abandon their home. One evening, an elderly man who ran the small gas station saw something that made his heart skip. A few trucks had parked across the highway again. Men were standing around them, smoking, laughing loudly, and pointing toward town. He quietly went back inside and locked the door. Then he called the police station. The line rang a long time before someone answered. The officer promised to send a car, but no one came for hours. That night, the four men met behind the church. They stood near the old bell tower looking out at the fields. The air was thick and quiet. One of them pulled out a small folded map of the area. They spoke in low voices, their movements steady, their eyes sharp. Anyone watching them would have noticed something different about them. Not fear, but readiness. Back in the town square, life carried on, unaware of what was coming. The grocery owner closed up early, turning the sign to closed as the sky turned orange. Across the street, two teenagers rode their bikes home, laughing as they raced each other down the lane. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days again. Before the fear, before the threats. But a sense of unease still hung over everything. Even the dogs barked more than usual that night. The old pastor stood outside the church looking up at the dark clouds. He didn't know why, but he whispered a prayer for protection. At the same time, far down the highway, the gang gathered again. They were louder than before, more confident. They talked about teaching the town a lesson. One of them kicked the dirt and said, "They think they can ignore us. Let's see how they feel when their precious little streets are burning." Laughter followed, rough and cruel, but they had no idea that someone was already watching them. The four men from a distance had seen the trucks gathering. They watched through binoculars, silent, patient. One of them muttered, "They're getting ready." Another replied quietly, "Then so are we." The town slept, unaware that the line between peace and chaos was growing thin. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the old signs creak. Somewhere a dog howled. Inside one of the small houses, a young couple sat at their kitchen table holding hands. They talked about whether to send their kids to stay with relatives for a while. They didn't want to leave, but they also didn't want to risk staying. They didn't know that. Just a few streets away, the four visitors were already setting silent traps, checking sightlines, and marking out safe zones. They didn't plan to use weapons. They weren't here to start a war. They were here to protect. When the last light in town went out that night, only the sound of crickets filled the air. The men stayed awake, taking turns keeping watch near the edge of town. They moved quietly like shadows blending into the dark. They had done this before, in deserts, in jungles, in places far from home. But tonight felt different. Tonight wasn't a mission for medals or orders. It was about people, ordinary people who just wanted to live in peace. The night stretched on slowly. In the distance, faint engine noises came and went, but nothing happened. Around midnight, rain began to fall softly. The sound of it against the rooftops was oddly comforting. One by one, the houses went quiet. But under the soft rain and the stillness of that dark town, something was changing. The fear that had held everyone hostage was beginning to meet something stronger. Quiet courage. Standing guard unseen. And though no one in town knew it yet, by the time the next storm rolled in, their small forgotten community would no longer be defenseless. The morning after the quiet night came with a calm that felt almost strange. The streets were wet from the rain. The air smelled fresh and sunlight peeked through soft clouds. People came out slowly, sweeping water off porches, opening shop doors, and pretending everything was normal. But under that calm surface, the same unease lingered. No one said it out loud, but everyone was waiting for the next bad thing to happen. At the diner, the regulars gathered again for coffee and breakfast. The waitress poured cups with a tired smile, though she hadn't slept much. The four visitors sat quietly in their usual corner booth. They had a few maps spread out in front of them, covered by an old newspaper so no one could see what they were doing. Every now and then, one of them would glance out the window, watching the slow traffic roll by. The old pastor came in, tipping his hat to everyone as he made his way to the counter. "Morning," he said softly. "Seems peaceful today." The waitress nodded. "Let's hope it stays that way." But peace felt fragile, like a candle flame in the wind. Later that day, one of the four men walked to the hardware store to buy a few things: duct tape, nails, rope, and a handful of batteries. The store owner looked at the pile and said with a curious smile, "Building something?" "Just fixing what's broken." the man replied with a friendly grin. Across town, two of the others were helping rebuild an old wooden fence for a woman who lived near the school. She offered them water, thanking them for their kindness. They waved it off, saying, "It's nothing, ma'am. We're just glad to help." But the truth was they weren't just fixing fences or lights, they were quietly preparing. Each of them knew something was coming, and from their years of training, they could sense it would be soon. That afternoon, the local police chief finally stopped by the diner to speak with the pastor. He looked uneasy. "We got word," he said quietly, "that some boys from across the county have been bragging, talking about coming back out here. Might just be talk, but still." The pastor's face grew serious. "You think they mean it this time?" The chief sighed. "I don't know. But we're not ready for any kind of trouble. There's only 3 of us on duty tonight, and if a crowd comes through—" He didn't finish the sentence. The 4 visitors overheard the conversation but stayed silent. They exchanged brief glances, saying everything they needed to without words. By evening, the men were walking through town, checking corners, noting which streetlights were working and which weren't. They looked at every alley, every open space, and every escape route. One of them climbed up to the roof of an old store to get a higher view. From there, he could see the long stretch of highway that curved toward the town. He stayed there until the sun began to dip behind the hills. The town lights flickered on one by one as darkness settled. The diner closed early again. The streets emptied. From a distance, the town looked peaceful. Quiet houses, small shops, and an old church bell glowing softly under a street lamp. But the men knew that peace could be broken in a second. They gathered behind the community hall as night deepened. The sound of crickets filled the air. One of them unfolded a map on the hood of a pickup truck. "They'll come in from the highway," he said calmly. "That's the only wide entrance. We'll set the first block here." He pointed to the corner of Main Street. "If they get past that, we guide them here." His finger traced a narrow route between 2 buildings. They talked quietly for nearly an hour, finalizing everything. No weapons, no aggression, just control and protection. They didn't want anyone hurt, not even the ones who meant harm. The goal was simple: stop the chaos before it reached the heart of town. When the meeting ended, each man took a different direction. One went toward the church, another near the diner, one near the grocery store, and the last stayed close to the main road. They moved quietly, blending with the dark. The night was cool and still. Around midnight, clouds began to cover the stars. The air felt heavy again, thick with that same tension from before. Somewhere far off, engines rumbled faintly, distant but growing louder. In one of the small houses, a mother woke suddenly. She didn't know why, but she felt uneasy. She walked to the window and peered out, seeing nothing but the still street. Then she heard it too, the faint hum of engines, the sound of something approaching. Her heart began to race. The 4 men were already awake, already moving. The first one, near the road, watched as several trucks appeared on the horizon, their headlights cutting through the dark. He clicked his small radio once, a quiet signal. The others instantly knew. The trucks slowed near the town's welcome sign, just as they had before. But this time they didn't stop. They rolled forward, louder, closer, filling the night with the sound of heavy tires and raised voices. Inside town, porch lights began to flicker on. Curtains moved as sleepy faces peeked out, frightened and uncertain. The pastor, who had been awake reading his Bible, stood up and looked outside. His hands trembled slightly as he whispered another prayer. The trucks entered the main road. There were several of them now, enough to fill the street. But as they reached the edge of town, something unexpected happened. The first truck hit a spike strip laid neatly across the road. Its tires burst instantly with a loud pop, forcing the driver to stop. The second truck swerved to avoid it and hit a hidden barrier made of sandbags and debris. Within seconds, confusion spread among them. Voices shouted, doors slammed. But the men in the shadows were already moving, fast and silent. They didn't fight. They used light and sound. Smoke filled the air from harmless canisters, disorienting the intruders. Loud metal bangs echoed down the street, making it impossible to tell how many people were out there. The men stayed calm. One moved between buildings, cutting off escape routes. Another guided the few frightened townspeople who had come outside back into their homes. Everything was controlled, every movement precise. The invaders, blinded and panicked, stumbled and shouted over each other. They couldn't see who or what was around them. One by one, they were forced to stop. realizing they were surrounded by people they couldn't see but who clearly knew what they were doing. In less than 15 minutes, the chaos stopped. The men were careful not to use force. They just cornered the group and blocked their trucks from leaving. By the time the first police car arrived, sirens blaring, it was already over. The chief stepped out, eyes wide. What in the world happened here? The four men stood quietly near the side of the road, helping tie up the last bit of rope around the damaged truck. One of them looked at the chief and said, "You've got some folks here who need a ride to the station." The chief looked at them in disbelief. "You did this? Just the four of you?" They shrugged. "We just stopped a bad night from getting worse." The gang members, now sitting on the curb, looked stunned. Some of them muttered angrily, but none dared move. The police began cuffing them one by one, while townspeople gathered slowly, whispering in amazement. The old pastor arrived last, clutching his jacket tightly against the wind. He looked at the four men, eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us," he said quietly. One of them shook his head. "No, sir. You saved yourselves. We just made sure no one got hurt." By morning, the story had already spread. People came out of their houses in disbelief, seeing the trucks lined up and the town still standing. The bakery owner wept when she saw her shop untouched. Children pointed curiously at the tire marks on the street, not fully understanding what had happened. The local newspaper printed a short piece the next day. "Attempted attack stopped in small town. Unknown men step in." It didn't give names or details, but everyone in town knew who those unknown men were. Still, they didn't talk about it much. The men themselves stayed quiet, avoiding attention. They helped clean up the mess, fixing fences, clearing the broken glass, and repainting signs. They didn't want praise. They just wanted the people to feel safe again. That evening, the town gathered near the church for a small meeting. The pastor stood at the front, speaking softly. "Last night could have been the end of our peace," he said. But it wasn't. Because courage showed up when fear tried to take over. The crowd clapped quietly, some with tears in their eyes. The four men stood in the back, listening. They didn't speak, just nodded respectfully. Then, as the sun set again over the quiet little town, they turned and walked away down the road, fading into the twilight. For the first time in weeks, people slept without fear. The streets were quiet, but this time it wasn't the silence of worry. It was the peace that comes when you know someone's watching over you. The days that followed were quiet. The town, for the first time in a long while, felt calm again. People walked slower, smiled more, and even the children started playing outside after sunset. The air felt lighter, as if a heavy shadow had finally lifted. But underneath that peace, a few hearts still beat with unease. They all wondered the same thing. Was it really over? The four men stayed around town, helping wherever they could. They repaired a few damaged roofs, replaced windows, and helped repaint the old community center. No one had asked them to stay, but no one wanted them to leave either. People trusted them now. It was something about their quiet way of moving, the steadiness in their eyes, and how they never asked for thanks. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, the town gathered at the park for a small celebration. Tables were filled with food, music played softly, and for the first time in months, laughter filled the air again. Children ran around chasing each other while adults sat together sharing stories. The pastor stood near the stage, looking out over the crowd with pride. He said softly, "We made it through the storm." The four men stood a little apart from the crowd, leaning against a fence, smiling quietly. They weren't used to being honored, and they didn't want to be. They were just glad to see life coming back to this place. But peace, they knew, had to be protected. And sometimes danger doesn't disappear. It only hides. Later that night, when most people had gone home, one of the men noticed something strange. A pickup truck drove slowly past the edge of town. Its lights were off, and it didn't stop. It just rolled quietly by, disappearing down the dirt road. He didn't say anything right away, but his instincts told him it wasn't nothing. The next morning, he gathered the others. "They're watching again," he said simply. None of them looked surprised. They all knew how these things worked. The troublemakers from before had been caught, but that didn't mean everyone involved had been. Sometimes others tried to come back for revenge or to prove a point. Still, the town didn't need to know that, not yet. People deserved a few days of peace, So the men kept it to themselves, quietly increasing their patrols. They checked every road at night, moved through alleyways, and even kept an eye on the highway. Days passed without incident. The locals noticed the men were out late, but they assumed they were just keeping watch. It gave everyone a sense of safety knowing someone strong was still awake while they slept. Then, one night, heavy rain returned. Thunder rolled far in the distance and flashes of lightning lit up the sky. Most people stayed inside, but the men took shelter under the gas station canopy, scanning the empty road. Around midnight they heard it again. Engines in the distance, but this time the sound was different. More engines, more movement. The men exchanged looks. "It's not over," one said quietly. The trucks appeared like shadows through the rain. Headlights flickered in the distance. There were more than before, at least a dozen. The men could barely make out the figures inside, but they could tell these weren't kids looking for trouble. These were grown men, angry and reckless, coming back for something they shouldn't. The first man spoke calmly. "We can't let them reach the houses." The others nodded. Without another word, they split off into the darkness. The storm raged as they moved, rain soaking their clothes, boots splashing through puddles. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing brief glimpses of their determined faces. They worked quickly, using every bit of experience they had. They set up diversions along the main road, fallen branches, flashing lights, anything that could slow down a vehicle without harm. When the trucks finally entered town, they were met not by chaos but by confusion. The roads were slick, the signs hard to read, and the rain made visibility nearly impossible. One truck tried to turn down the wrong lane and ended up stuck in the mud. Another swerved suddenly as a bright light flashed across its windshield. Through the storm, the men moved with quiet precision. They guided the confusion, keeping it away from homes and shops. The people of the town, sleeping through the rain, never heard the soft signals or saw the movements in the dark. The group of intruders tried to regroup, shouting over the thunder. But their voices carried in the wrong direction, echoing down empty streets. Every time they tried to move forward, something blocked them. A fallen cart, a low barricade, a flash of light from a flashlight beam that seemed to vanish before they could find the source. For nearly an hour, the rain poured and the confusion spread. No violence, no direct fight, just smart, careful control. Eventually, the frustrated men realized they were trapped in their own confusion. One by one, they turned their trucks around and sped back the way they came, tires skidding on the wet road. When silence finally returned, the four men stood in the rain, drenched and exhausted. They didn't celebrate. They just nodded to each other and walked back toward town. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear again and sunlight sparkled off puddles. People came out yawning, stretching, unaware of how close they had come to danger again. The four men sat at the diner quietly drinking coffee. They looked tired but calm. The waitress asked, "A rough night?" One of them smiled faintly. "Just a bit of rain." As the day went on, a few townsfolk found tire tracks near the road, deep ruts leading out of town. The police chief came by, scratching his head. "Looks like someone tried to come through last night," he said. "Guess they changed their minds." The pastor smiled knowingly. Maybe they realize this town isn't an easy target anymore. Word began to spread again, but the story this time was softer, more like a legend. People talked about the mysterious rainstorm that scared off the troublemakers, about how the town had protectors who never slept. Children whispered stories about heroes in the dark who made bad people disappear. That week, something changed in the town. The fear that had once ruled every heart began to fade completely. People stopped locking themselves indoors so early. The diner stayed open late again. The laughter came back, real and loud. One afternoon, the four men helped rebuild the old playground that had been broken down for years. As they worked, kids ran around watching them with admiration. An old woman brought them lemonade, saying softly, "You've given us our peace back." They smiled and thanked her, but said nothing more. When evening came, the men sat together on the hill outside town. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in orange and red. For the first time since they'd arrived, they allowed themselves to relax. They talked quietly about life, about places they'd seen, and about how good it felt to see people smiling again. They knew they wouldn't stay much longer. Their purpose here was almost done. They came when the town needed them most, and now it was standing tall again. Stronger, braver, united. Before dawn the next day, they packed their few things. The town was still asleep as they loaded their truck. One of them walked down Main Street one last time, looking at the freshly painted walls and the children's drawings taped to shop windows. He smiled. The town looked alive again. As they started the engine, the pastor appeared from the corner carrying a small box. "Before you go," he said softly, "take this. It's just a small gift." Inside was a wooden cross carved by one of the local carpenters, simple but beautiful. "For protection," he said. The man nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir. But I think this town's protected just fine now." The pastor smiled, his eyes shining. "Still, keep it. You never know who you'll have to watch over next." The men shook his hand one by one, then drove off as the morning light began to spread. When the townspeople woke up, they found the truck gone. On the church steps there was a note written in simple handwriting. "You were never alone. Stay strong. Protect each other." Years later, people would still talk about that night, the night when rain, courage, and faith came together to defend a forgotten town. They'd tell their children that no matter how dark the storm gets, there's always someone out there watching over those who stand together. And even though no one ever saw the four men again, every time a storm rolled across the hills, the townspeople would look out their windows and smile softly, whispering, "They're still out there." Keeping watch, the town had changed. You could feel it in the air. People smiled more, talked more, and didn't look over their shoulders as much anymore. The fear that once lived in every corner had finally started to fade. It was like the whole place had taken a deep breath for the first time in months. The four men who had stayed to protect the town were still around, though now they blended in like part of the community. They helped with repairs, joined in small gatherings, and sometimes just sat quietly in the park, watching families play. They didn't speak much about what had happened before. In fact, they never brought it up. For them, the peace was enough. One morning, the pastor walked through town and saw people painting walls, planting flowers, and fixing old signs. The grocery owner had put up new lights outside the shop, and the diner had reopened its outdoor tables for breakfast again. Everything looked brighter, alive again. The pastor smiled to himself. It felt like a miracle, but even miracles need time to heal. Some people still carried the fear inside them. The older folks, especially, would glance nervously whenever a loud engine passed down the road. The children who had once hidden under blankets at night still asked their parents if the bad people were gone for good. One afternoon, the pastor stopped by the diner to see the four men. They were sitting by the window, quietly drinking coffee. He smiled warmly and said, "You know this town owes you more than it can ever repay." One of the men shook his head gently. "You don't owe us anything, sir. We just did what anyone should do." The pastor chuckled softly. "Maybe so, but not everyone can do it with the heart you men have." He paused, then looked out the window. "You've given people hope again. That's something we were losing." The men didn't respond right away. They just nodded, grateful but humble. For them, what mattered most was that people could live without fear again. As days passed, they continued helping quietly, fixing the playground swings, repainting the old town hall, and setting up lights along the streets. At night, they sometimes walked around, not because they expected trouble, but because old habits die hard. They liked to make sure everyone was safe before turning in. One evening, the sky turned a deep orange as the sun went down. The town gathered near the park for a community dinner. There was laughter, music, and the smell of grilled food in the air. The men stood near the edge, watching families dance and children play. It was simple but beautiful. An old woman walked up to them with a plate of food. "You boys never take a break," she said kindly. "Come eat something." They smiled and joined her, sitting on a bench. As they ate, she began to tell them stories about the town, how it used to be before fear took over, how people would hold street fairs and sing late into the night. As she spoke, one of the men said softly, "Maybe it can be like that again." The old woman smiled. "It already is, dear. You brought it back." The sound of laughter carried across the park, and for a moment the four men just watched in silence. They weren't thinking about what they had done or what might happen next. They were simply taking in the peace they had helped restore. But peace always attracts attention. A few days later, a news van arrived in town. Word of what had happened had spread far beyond the county. The reporters wanted to talk to people, to tell the story of the small town that stood strong against hate. The pastor wasn't sure what to say at first. He didn't like the idea of cameras, but he understood that maybe sharing the story could help others. When the reporter asked, "Who were the men that stopped it all?" the pastor only smiled and said, "They were friends. That's all you need to know. The 4 men didn't appear on camera. They stayed away, not wanting fame or recognition. For them, it wasn't about being heroes, it was about doing what was right." The report aired a few days later. It spread across the internet and television under different titles. The Town That Fought Back, Silent Heroes, Courage in the Dark. People all over the country watched in awe. Some even came to visit the town afterward, just to see the place where strangers had stood up for what was right. The townsfolk welcomed the visitors warmly, but never boasted about what had happened. They spoke about community, unity, and faith, but they never mentioned the details. It became more of a story of people coming together than a story of danger. In the weeks that followed, letters started arriving at the town hall. Some were from nearby towns, others from faraway states. People wrote things like, "Your story gave me hope," and "Thank you for showing that there's still goodness in the world." The pastor kept every letter in a box near the church altar. He said they were reminders of how light can spread, even from the smallest places. Meanwhile, the 4 men continued to live quietly. They started helping with local projects, teaching self-defense at the community center, and training volunteers on how to protect their neighborhoods safely without violence. They never talked about their past, but their discipline and calm strength showed everyone that they had lived through much more than they said. One afternoon, while they were setting up new equipment at the playground, a young boy came running up to them. "My dad says you're heroes," the boy said proudly. One of the men smiled, kneeling down to his level. "Your dad's wrong," he said kindly. "Heroes are people who take care of each other every day. Like your dad, your teacher, your mom. We just helped for a little while." The boy thought about that, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but I still think you're brave." The man smiled and patted his shoulder. "Then you be brave too, all right?" Moments like that were what made everything worth it. Seeing courage grow in others. Seeing faith return to a place where fear once lived. As summer rolled in, the town began planning a festival, something they hadn't done in years. There would be music, food, games, and dancing in the streets. The pastor said it would be a celebration of light after the storm. The 4 men helped organize it quietly, building stages, setting up lights, and arranging safety measures. When the night of the festival came, the whole town came alive. Strings of lights hung across Main Street, children held balloons, and music filled the air. The 4 men stood at the back, watching with quiet pride. People danced, laughed, and cheered. There was no fear, no worry, just life, full and free. As fireworks lit up the sky, the pastor walked up beside them. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he turned to them and said, "Do you see this? This is what you gave us. This is what courage does." One of the men replied softly, "We just stood guard. You all gave yourselves this moment." The pastor nodded slowly. "Maybe. But sometimes people need to see courage before they remember they have it too." The fireworks reflected in their eyes as they watched the sky. For the first time in a long while, they felt something deeper than peace. It was belonging. This small town that had once been afraid now felt like home, but deep down they knew they couldn't stay forever. Their work was done here. There were other places, other people who might need the same quiet protection. Still, they didn't say anything that night. They just stood there, smiling at the joy around them. Later, as the music faded and people started heading home, one of the men looked around the square and whispered, "We did good here." The others nodded. They walked through the quiet streets, the glow of light still reflecting on the wet pavement. The town, their town now, slept peacefully. And for the first time, so did they. In the morning, children would find footprints near the park, the same ones that had been there since the beginning. The townsfolk would talk about them, wondering if the protectors had gone, but no one would be sad. They'd just smile and say, wherever they are, they're doing what they do best. And somewhere beyond the hills, as dawn broke over the fields, a truck rolled down the highway, heading toward a new horizon. Inside sat 4 quiet men who didn't need medals or headlines. They carried something far greater, the peace of a town they had helped heal. And though they left without saying goodbye, their spirits stayed behind, living in the laughter, the lights, and the courage that would never fade again. Months passed since the festival that changed everything. The little town had grown brighter with each new day. Shops had fresh paint, gardens were blooming again, and laughter had become part of daily life. It was as if the past had finally loosened its grip. People walked with confidence now. The fear that once shadowed their steps had disappeared, replaced by pride and unity. But something felt different. The 4 men who had guarded the town were gone. They had left quietly without a word or a note. Only their footprints remained that morning, faint in the dust by the park road. At first, no one knew what to think. Some thought they had gone on a trip. Others believed they had been called away for another mission. The pastor simply said, "They came to bring peace, and peace doesn't stay still." Even though the men had left, their presence lingered in every corner. The playground they built was full of children's laughter. The park lights they strung up still glowed warmly at night. The people often said, "You can't see them, but you can still feel them." Every weekend, the town gathered for picnics, markets, and small concerts. It had become a tradition, something that brought everyone together. It reminded them not of what they had survived, but of how they had stood together when it mattered. One afternoon, a young woman who worked at the diner was wiping tables when she noticed an envelope tucked beneath the counter. It was plain with no name on it. She opened it and found a simple handwritten note. "Keep looking after each other." That's all the guard ever wanted. She showed it to the pastor and he read it quietly. There was no signature, but he smiled. "It's from them," he said softly. "They're still watching over us." The story of the town's rebirth had already spread far beyond the hills. More people began visiting, some curious, some inspired. A few came from places that were struggling too, hoping to learn how to build back their own sense of peace. The townsfolk welcomed everyone with open arms, offering food, stories, and smiles. Over time, the town became known for its warmth, not its past. Newspapers wrote stories calling it the town of second chances. Travelers would stop by the small church, the diner, and the park, just to feel what so many had heard about, an unspoken calm that seemed to live in the air. The pastor often told visitors, "This place healed because people chose kindness over fear." He never mentioned the 4 men by name, but their memory sat quietly behind every word. One rainy evening, the pastor sat on the church steps watching the drops fall softly on the street. A truck slowed as it passed by, and for a brief moment he thought he saw familiar faces through the window. 4 silhouettes, quiet and steady, like old friends passing through. He blinked, and the truck disappeared into the rain. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Godspeed wherever you're headed." The men, meanwhile, had driven far beyond the county line. They hadn't spoken much about what happened back there. It wasn't something they needed to talk about. They had seen enough of the world to know when their time in a place was done. What mattered most was that they had left it better than they found it. Their truck rolled through long stretches of highway, towns fading behind them like pages turning in a book. Sometimes they stopped at small gas stations, sometimes near quiet lakes, just sitting and talking about ordinary things, the weather, music, old memories. One night, they camped by a riverside. The fire flickered softly as they ate from tin plates. The night was calm, the kind that reminded them why they had chosen this life, to protect, not to fight. One of them stared into the flames and said quietly, "It's strange how peace feels louder than war sometimes." Another nodded. "That's because peace leaves room for everything else. The laughter, the quiet, the little things we forget to notice." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the river. In that stillness, they felt the same calm they'd seen in the town's people. It was a reminder that courage didn't always roar. It sometimes whispered.